This is John. Thank you, Samantha, for joining me today to discuss about the ongoing student protests across universities in USA. In many societies, young people are often underestimated and viewed as powerless. However, throughout history, students have played a crucial role in some of the most significant protests. They recognize oppression and injustice, organizing in large numbers, and often risking their lives and futures. What is the latest news about kind of a student protests in Columbia University?
The latest news on Columbia University student protests likely centers around the demonstration April 2024. Students protested the university's investments in entities linked to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Protests included occupying the building, Hamilton Hall, and setting up a tent encampment. Demands included divestment, financial transparency, and amnesty for participating students. The situation escalated with the NYPD arresting over 100 protesters. These protests inspired similar actions on campuses across the country. It is important to note that this happened very recently, so there might be ongoing developments. Let's know
how many universities are there students are involved in protests in USA?
Unfortunately, there's no publicly available data source that tracks the exact number of universities experiencing student protests related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, news reports and social media indicate that protests have occurred on campuses across the United States. Reports mention universities from New York to California, Emerson College, Harvard University, the University of Southern California, UCLA, the University of Texas at Austin. This is not an exhaustive list, and protests may have taken place at other universities as well.
According to the public news reports, how many students are arrested across all universities in USA? Any death reported?
Public news reports typically don't provide information on the exact number of arrests. That there might be law enforcement reports with this data, but such information is not always publicly available. While the reports mention hundreds of arrests across various universities, it is likely not a definitive number. Additionally, there haven't been any reports of deaths related to these protests.
What are the reasons of the ongoing student protests across universities in USA?
The ongoing student protests in U.S. universities primarily focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the boycott, divestment and sanctions, BDS movement. Students are protesting against their universities and investments in companies or funds that potentially profit from the ongoing conflict in Gaza, policies they perceive as supportive of Israel's actions. They are demanding divestment, that universities sever financial ties with companies or funds seen as profiting from that conflict. Increased transparency on university investments and support for Palestinians. These protests were sparked by the recent escalation in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but the BDS movement has roots in much longer-standing tensions.
Are there any organizations to lead the ongoing student protests?
Well, there is not a single unified organization protests across U.S. universities. Several prominent groups are at the forefront. Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, a national student organization that advocates for Palestinian human rights. They have chapters at many universities and actively organize protests and educational events. If Not Now movement, a Jewish-led group critical of Israeli policies towards Palestinians. They often partner with SJP chapters on campuses. Movement for Black Lives, PROC polls, a broader social justice coalition that has expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause and joined some campus protests. Sunrise Movement, a youth-led environmental activist organization that has also joined protests, highlighting the connection between militarism and climate change. These are just a few examples, and many other student groups and organizations are participating in the protests, depending on the specific campus and its concerns.
What are the potential pressures that students are facing for the protests?
Students participating in the protests for the Israel-Palestine conflict on U.S. campuses can face a number of pressures. Here are some potential challenges. Missing class. Protests can disrupt class schedules, leading to missed lectures, assignments, or exams. This can put pressure on students to catch up on missed work while balancing their activism. Negative perception from professors. Some professors might view participation in protests negatively, impacting student grades or relationships. There are also social pressures. Peer disapproval. Not all students agree with the protests. Disagreements with friends or classmates can create tension and social pressure. Feeling isolated, students who participate in protests might feel isolated if the prevailing campus sentiment leans towards the other side of the issue. And then in adaptation, there are some pressures. Universities might have policies regarding protests or disruptions, leading to potential disciplinary action, including warnings, fines, or even suspension. Difficulty organizing protests. University regulations concerning demonstrations or space availability could make it difficult to organize or hold protests on campus. External pressures, media scrutiny. Protests can attract media attention, potentially leading to negative portrayals or misrepresentation of student actions. Arrests or police interaction. Depending on the protest's intensity and location, students might face arrest or confrontation with police. Financial pressures. Loss of scholarship funding. Some scholarships might have clauses regarding participation in disruptive activities, potentially jeopardizing financial aid. Job market impact. And while unlikely, some employers might hold negative views about student activism, impacting future job prospects. It is important to remember that these are potential pressures, and the specific situation will vary depending on the campus, the nature of the protest, and individual circumstances.
What are the governmental attitudes to the student protests across universities in the USA?
The U.S. government generally takes a hands-off approach to student protests on university campuses. This means they don't directly intervene or express strong opinions on the specific causes. However, there are some nuances to consider. Free speech. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech and assembly, which protects students' right to protest peacefully. The government wouldn't restrict protests based solely on disagreement with the cause. Local law enforcement. While the federal government doesn't involved, local law enforcement has the responsibility to maintain order and public safety during protests. Their response can vary depending on the city and the severity of the demonstrations. Finally, individual politicians. Individual politicians might express personal opinions on the Israel-Palestine conflict or student activism in general. These opinions can range from support for the protests to criticism. Overall, the U.S. government prioritizes free speech and avoids directly interfering with campus protests. However, local law enforcement might be involved in maintaining order, and individual politicians might voice their own views.
What did New York Police Department take actions to student protests in the Columbia University?
Based on these reports of the April 2024 protests at Columbia University, the New York Police Department, NYPD, took the following actions. Initially held back. NYPD initially stated they would not enter Columbia's grounds unless there was an imminent emergency or a request from the university. Intervention upon request. Following a request from Columbia University President Manoush Shafiq, NYPD officers entered the campus to remove protesters who had occupied a building and a nearby arrest. News reports mentioned that dozens of protesters were arrested during the NYPD intervention. It's important to note that details like the specific tactics used by the New York Kinstel dynamic demonstration with the use of force might not be available in all news reports.
What do you think how the ongoing student protests across universities progress in the next couple months?
Predicting the progress of the student protests over the next few months is difficult. Here is a breakdown of some factors that could influence their trajectory. Some factors that could sustain or intensify the protests. Continuing Israel-Palestine conflict. If the conflict intensifies, it could reignite student outrage and lead to renewed protests, or even escalate existing ones. University response. If universities are perceived as unresponsive to student demands, it could fuel further protests. Media coverage. Continued media attention, especially if it portrays student activism favorably, could embolden protesters and inspire similar actions at other campuses. Factors that could lead to a decrease in protests. Reduce tensions in Israel-Palestine. De-escalation in the conflict could take the wind out of the protests, especially if students feel their message has been heard. University concessions. If universities meet some student demands, such as increased transparency on investments, it could lead to a reduction in protest intensity. Exam period approaching. As final exams approach, student focus might shift away from activism towards academics, leading to a lull in protest. Summer break. The arrival of summer break could significantly reduce protest activity as many students leave campus. Possible scenarios. Sustained protests. If the Israel-Palestine conflict continues and universities do not meet student demands, protests could persist at a moderate level throughout the summer, potentially picking up again in the fall semester. Increased intensity. A significant escalation in the conflict or a perceived lack of university response could lead to more intense protests. Civil disobedience tactics. Fading momentum, de-escalation of the conflict or university concessions could lead to a gradual decrease in protest activity, eventually fizzling out by summer break. It's important to remember that this is just speculation. The actual course of the protests will depend on a complex interplay of various factors.
Can you tell what are the potential impacts of this ongoing student protests across universities on our society.
The ongoing student protests regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict have the potential to bring about various impacts on U.S. society. Here's a breakdown of some potential consequences. Increased awareness and education. The protests can raise public awareness about the complexities of the Israel-Palestine conflict, prompting people to learn more and engage in civil discourse. This can lead to a more informed citizenry with a deeper understanding of the issues at stake. Political pressure and policy changes. Sustained protests can put pressure on politicians to take a stronger stance on the conflict or reconsider U.S. policy towards Israel or Palestine. In the long run, this could potentially influence U.S. foreign policy in the region. Shift in public opinion. The protests can contribute to a shift in public opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict, potentially increasing sympathy for the Palestinian cause. This could influence how the U.S. government interacts with both sides in the future. Divisiveness, polarization. The protests can also exacerbate existing societal divisions on the issue, with strong opinions on both sides leading to polarization and hindered dialogue. Impact on the academic discourse. The protests can create a climate of tension and pressure on potentially chilling free speech or academic inquiry related to the Middle East. Solidarity movements and activism. The student protests can inspire similar movements advocating for social justice on other issues, leading to a more engaged and active citizenry. Challenges to university administration. The protests can create challenges for university administrators who need to balance student activism with maintaining order and academic freedom on campus. The overall impact of the protests will depend on their intensity, duration, and how they are addressed by universities, the government, and the media. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you have learned more about student protests. Again, students have played a crucial role in those significant protests. They recognize oppression and injustice, organizing in large numbers and often risking their lives and futures. Please subscribe to our channel.